Hey everyone, this is a SHINEcast podcast where we broadcast our thoughts and feelings. I'm the host AJ,
I'm Mia.
And I'm Tanya.
and we have a special guest here today, Dr. Judy Ho. So, Dr. Judy Ho, we would like to start this podcast off by talking more about how you have deal with psychological, incidents in your career and what you do as as a career and what you inspire others.
Well, thank you so much for having me on your podcast, guys. It's so cool that you're doing this. I feel like I still don't know the podcast game myself. I have recorded some episodes, but I certainly don't have any of the tech down. So that's amazing that you guys are doing everything in-house, and it's such a great teamwork project that you guys have, and I just admire that so much. So I started working in psychology, technically since I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. I was essentially always curious about the human mind and was very interested in psychology as a major. But really, I think I got my even earlier start when I was in the Big Brother Big Sisters program when I was in high school, and I got to meet this little girl. I was 15 and she was 10 at the time, and she had been through so many group homes. And I just felt like it was so interesting that even though I didn't know anything, I was just a 15-year-old, just showing up every week for her really made a difference. So that's really what inspired me to do my work. And now I just think that one of my major missions is to try to destigmatize mental health and mental illness for as many people as possible, because there's still a lot of stigma out there, and then try to give people practical strategies based in science.
Thank you so much. So we did a little bit of research about you, and we found out you worked on a book and called The New Rules of Attachment.
Mm-hmm.
What inspired you to focus on attachment theory itself? And could you please describe what attachment theory is to our audience?
Yeah, so attachment theory is all about those very crucial bonds that we have with the primary caregivers of our lives, especially when we're young, because all human beings, we are all born essentially kind of helpless, right? We always need people to take care of us, especially in those early years. And so those early relationships that you have with the people who are tasked to take care of you on a day-to-day basis, it really forms your ideas about yourself, how you think other people will respond when you're in stress, how you approach relationships, and ultimately whether or not you even believe you deserve good things in life. And so that is really why I wanted to focus on attachment theory, because it has so much of an implication for you throughout life.
Thank you so much. Can you explain like the subcategories, like avoiding, different types of attachment theories that they are in the psychological, world?
Yeah, for sure. So there's 4 different categories of attachment. There's 1 secure attachment and then 3 insecure types. And so the secure attachment is a type of attachment where essentially, generally, your relationship with your early caregiver was pretty strong. So generally, they were around, they were available to you emotionally. When you were under stress, they would comfort you, and you just knew that you could rely on them. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you had perfect parents or caregivers, but just generally, you believe that they're going to be around to help you. And so a person who has secure attachment grows up to have more healthy self-esteem than the other types. They can be pretty independent, but they also feel comfortable relying on other people. There's 3 insecure types, as I mentioned, and the first one is anxious attachment. So that is essentially a person who sometimes grew up with parents who may have not been the most consistent. Maybe sometimes they were there, maybe sometimes they weren't. Perhaps they were wrapped up in some of their own stuff, right? And so the child learns that maybe that support is not always going to be there. So they develop basically an anxious attachment to their primary caregiver. They're always constantly looking for validation. Are you still around? And as an adult, that also translates to being sometimes overly dependent on other people for your self-esteem. Then there's avoidant attachment, where oftentimes their primary caregivers just generally dismiss their emotional expressions. Like, well, I don't like it when you cry, or don't cry anymore, like only babies cry, things like that. And again, this is not blaming the parents. I think that sometimes people think, oh, hey, I'm gonna try to make my kid a bit tougher. But still, I think what that boils down to is the person then realizes, okay, I can only count on myself. So they actually end up being ultra hyper independent, and they get really focused on careers and goals as a way to manage their self-esteem. And the last insecure type is the disorganized type. So this is a type that has gone through major trauma sometimes, or really significant stressors when they were a child. And so as a result, they're kind of in fight or flight all the time. And their internal life feels very chaotic. And as an adult, they have a harder time regulating their emotions when difficult feelings come up.
Thank you. I take AP psychology as well at our school, and we were just learning about that, so it was great.
Cool.
Yeah.
And it's great that you mentioned parenting styles. So I know a lot of parents, they want the best for their children, and it isn't something that's done intentionally. What would you say parents can do to be more mindful of their behaviors and actions towards children so that they don't end up with any of these insecure attachment styles?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tanya. And I think so many of us, I think even me included, because I'm a parent now, I'm a new parent. Yeah, I have a 3-year-old.
Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah. And so I was just reflecting back. I don't think I had AP psychology, AJ. That's so cool that you guys have that. I didn't
Yeah.
even get a chance to do that in high school and think about these things. But I feel like sometimes with parents, you're always wondering if you're doing the right thing. It's like you're never going to always do the right thing. But I think the most important thing is just to, as you said, Tanya, just be mindful, like just be present. I've noticed sometimes that in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I've had a really busy week, so I'm going to take my son to do this and do that and like all of these fun activities. And honestly, all he wants is just for me to sit with him. Like it's so simple, just to be present. So I think that's really important. And then I always tell parents too that it's kind of like the 80-20 rule. Like if 80% of the time you're doing your best and 20% of the time you make mistakes, your child's still going to turn out securely attached because it's about patterns, So the majority pattern is that they're there. And 20% of the time you get mad, you get upset, maybe you yell at them accidentally because you're having a bad day. That's not going to be something that's going to affect their attachment overall.
Well, thank you. And there's also something called self-sabotaging, which I think kind of relates to this whole attachment issues. Could you talk a little bit more about that, like self-sabotaging and why it's impactful to our relationships?
Yeah, so we get in our own way a lot of the time. I feel like oftentimes we say that we want something, we set a goal for ourselves, and then sometimes we second guess ourselves, and that's when you ultimately self-sabotage. And so you sometimes don't get that because you're like, wait, I set this goal, I must really want it, so why do I keep getting in my own way? It could be about all kinds of stuff, like saying that you really care about your grade in the class and then just waiting till the last minute to study, or saying that you really want a great relationship with this person, but just like having a hard time not picking fights with them, right? And I think that it's important for people to understand that just like attachment, self-sabotage comes from a place of survival. You're trying to survive, right? Attachment is important because you're trying to survive. So you have to have a healthy attachment, if possible, to your caregivers. Well, we self-sabotage because there's a part of us that's trying to protect ourselves from all kinds of things, like emotional embarrassment, stress, right? And obviously when you're going after a goal that's really important to you, it's not gonna be rainbows and sunshine all the time. There's gonna be difficulties. And so sometimes just subconsciously, we end up doing things to halt our progress because it's so much scarier to actually tackle it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like as us teenagers, we try to excel in all these classes and get the best grades as we want to, pursue our career and just know the best we can. And I feel like sometimes we can, be overconfident and say like, oh, I'm gonna get a 12 out of 12 on this quiz today, but I barely studied for
Right.
30 minutes last night.
Yeah.
So, and then you tend to beat yourself up for it later. Basically, what Tanya said, self-sabotage of how the things that we set cannot go the right way all the time. And I feel like we sometimes need to know that we do all make mistakes, and we can learn from mistakes.
Yeah, that's a really good example, because I think that sometimes, even though we know we didn't put maybe our full effort forward, like that example you just gave with a quiz, we're still expecting though that we're going to somehow perform perfectly. And then when you don't, you get so upset at yourself and you like beat up on yourself. And that's a form of self-sabotage too, because you you have selective memory. Like you forgot in a way that maybe you didn't study so hard, but all you can see is like, oh my gosh, I got a 6 out of 12 on this quiz or 8 out of 12 on this quiz. And you get so upset at yourself for it. And that actually ends up hurting your self-esteem, right? Because sometimes we think that we're motivating ourselves by being condescending to ourselves and being punishing, but actually that just tells you like, oh, well, I guess you don't matter, or like, I guess you're not good at things, and like that ends up cementing in your head, and then it carries over to other activities. And so anyway, I thought that was a really good example.
Yeah, I mean, that could also lead to like learned helplessness, where like, a student just thinks that, oh, why should I even study if I'm going to get that score, right?
Exactly.
And I feel like it takes a lot of self-reflection to identify these things and understand the psychology behind of it. So like, to anyone in the audience, how do you think is the best way to identify your type of attachment style, and why is that important?
I think that it's important because we are all here on this earth, I think, to understand ourselves better and to self-improve and to try to make a positive impact for the time that we have. And so that's why it's so important to know your attachment, because sometimes people will think, well, that was from so long ago, it's from the early years of my life. Does it really matter? It does, because during that time, you're soaking up information about the world, so the acquisition of information is rapid. And so the things that you learn first when you're in your first few years, they stay with you a lot longer than other things that happen when you get older, because then you've had so much more experience, right? So those early experiences end up becoming the templates for how you see your life and how you see yourself. And there's something interesting that we do as humans, which is to confirm things that we already think we know. So if there's like this existing belief, for example, that, oh, people aren't going to really be here for me because your caregiver was inconsistent, as you get older and you have other experiences, even ones that totally would not support that, it's like your mind just chooses to forget it, like put it out of your mind, or like, oh, that doesn't really matter. But then anytime you feel neglected or slighted by somebody, like that's going to go in your memory bank. You're going to say, like, see, I knew that. I knew I couldn't count on them. It's like you don't remember all the times that you could count on them, but just the one time they made a mistake, you're like, that's it, this friend sucks, right? So I just think that sometimes we don't realize that that's an automatic process unless we're doing the self-reflection.
And what are some signs that someone may be self-sabotaging in their relationship?
I think there's a lot of different ways that can happen, but that's a great question, Mia. I think that a lot of people don't even recognize that they're actually self-sabotaging their relationships. But I think it's like when you say that you want something, but then you keep going another direction instead. So one example would be saying, oh yeah, I definitely want to have a good relationship, whether it's with a friend or someone you're dating. But then you just pick everything that they do apart. It's like nothing's ever good enough. It's like, well, I would date them except they do this. Or like, oh, I don't like the color blue and they keep wearing blue. Like, it's like such small things that you use to try to dismiss their presence in your life. That's one way I see people self-sabotaging relationships. Another way is to test people too much. So like, they already said that they care about you. They already said that they love you, but like you constantly are setting up tests to see if they really care. And, over time, that person is going to get sick of that, and they're going to say, you know what, forget it. It's probably better that we're not in a relationship. And then, of course, again, the part of us that tries to confirm existing ideas will be like, see, I knew you were going to leave. It's like, yeah, but you kind of push them to leave. So I think those are two examples of self-sabotage in relationships that come to mind for me.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I really like that example about a relationship where you might push away someone and then, like, blame it on, like, oh, well, I knew they were going to leave. So if you find yourself in a relationship, or it can even just be a friendship, how can you communicate that? If you are already aware that you have these type of issues, how should you communicate that with your partner, friend?
Yeah, so I think if they're your friend or their partner, or your partner, like, I think the direct method is always the best. And sometimes people are afraid that if they're direct like that it's going to cause them to feel vulnerable, but it doesn't have to go that way. I mean, you can just be super direct and say it in a confident way, like, hey, I just feel a little bit like I'm kind of being insecure about it, but tell me what you think about this, right? So you kind of almost calling out your own feelings, but then basically putting it back on them. Like, well, what did you think about that? Or like, maybe it's just me being insecure, but I just noticed that the last couple times I texted you, it just took you longer to get back to me. And then instead of interpreting what that means, just ask them, well, what do you think about that? Or like, so what do you think? Like, honestly, that simple question is so helpful, because then you hear it from them instead of you basically accusing them of something like, oh, you haven't texted me back as often. That means you don't care about me. Like, because then they automatically puts them on the defensive, where if you ask a question like, well, what do you think? It makes them have to actually thoughtfully engage with the discussion. So I think even something so simple as just like calling out your own feelings about it. So that's you owning your feelings. And then the second part is just say, this is what I observed. What do you think about it? And just keep it to like a behavior without interpreting the behavior.
Yeah, I definitely feel like, you know, a lot of people have like high expectations in relationships and don't get what they want from the other person. So they just kind of disregard themselves. And, you know, that also forces the other person to like just back off a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Because once you're on the defensive or you're like, oh, I don't want this drama, like you will start to back away. And then, of course, that was your worst fear to begin with, but you actually created it, you know?
Correct.
Yeah.
And I would like to know, what do you think about the biggest challenges people face when they're trying to reparent their inner child?
I think the biggest challenge people face about reparenting is that they feel like it's something that they can't really accomplish. Like, okay, whatever, I had the parents that I had. Like, what does that even mean? Like, sometimes they don't know what reparenting means. And to me, I think reparenting is so simple. It's like the basics of reparenting is just basically giving that younger inner child that you have what it needed, but maybe didn't get enough of when they were a child, right? And this is, again, not about blaming parents, because like 95% of the time, they really try to do their best, but a lot of times they're going through their own stuff. Maybe they're carrying their own intergenerational trauma. But reparenting is all about you having that confidence and also knowing that now that you've lived life for a while, that you have the ability to heal yourself, right? And when I talk about the concreteness of reparenting, I think it really just boils down to like really specific things, like being willing to be very direct about the things that you need and want in a relationship. Prioritizing your own needs every once in a while. Like, it doesn't have to be about everyone else. Affirming that you deserve to be forgiven if you made a mistake, and having self-compassion. Knowing that you have self-worth no matter what. You know, so many of us feel like our self-worth is tied to something, whether it's like a relationship or a status or something that we achieve. But all human beings have worth just by being here. And I think that that's always one of the hardest things for people to grasp. Like, well, but how do I have worth? Like, this person has more worth than me. Like, no, we all have worth. Like, every single human being, every person. And that, I think, is the hardest one for people to get. And it takes time to like really believe in that statement.
Thank you. And also, I feel like it's kind of hard to allow yourself to like reparent yourself, especially if you have like an avoidant attachment style. You may be like, oh, I don't deserve these good things, instead of trying to like learn to change your mindset. So do you think like oftentimes it requires therapy, or do you think it's something that people can do on their own?
Yeah, I think therapy is obviously always helpful, because then you have somebody who is a clinician, a guide to work through all of this with you. But I also think that there's so much work that you can do on your own. And I think the idea is that you're not going to be necessarily in therapy for life. I mean, some people might want to do that, but I think the idea is that you learn these skill sets and you're able to apply them yourself. And then maybe you go back to therapy for a tune-up, or when things get difficult, you kind of want to go back for some booster sessions. So I definitely think that there's a lot you can do on your own. And I think that it starts with some really simple exercises. One thing that I really like to do is just, if I'm having an extra bad day, it's like, okay, just say one thing you appreciate about yourself. Like one thing that you're thankful for about yourself. Like say one positive attribute about yourself right now. That can really help just to turn things around, because sometimes you get in a negative spiral, and it's important that you interrupt that. And so it's even just reminding yourself of your worthwhile qualities, like of the things that you can do to contribute, your skill sets, your personality traits that bring value, you know, just anything that reminds you that you are somebody who is lovable and deserves to be cared for.
Also, you mentioned, recognizing that you're someone that's lovable. So would you say that these type of attachment styles don't just affect your relationships, but also your self-worth, like your physical appearance, or do you think they can lead into other types of like mental difficulties?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think when somebody has insecure attachment, oftentimes it depends on the kind of insecurity and a type of insecure attachment that might manifest differently. So somebody who has avoidant attachment, they may, at a time when they're having the most difficulty, pay the least attention to like how they put themselves together because they don't think that they're worth the effort. People with avoidant attachment at times might put too much focus into it because they're like, okay, I want everybody to think that I'm attractive and that I look good and whatever, because their validation ultimately comes from status and achievement sometimes because they really only can depend on themselves, or at least that's what they believe. And so I definitely think that it has a lot to do with it. And obviously the way that we treat ourselves and take care of ourselves, that's sending a biofeedback message to your brain, right? So like if you're taking care of your body, if you're taking like eating healthy, exercising, you know, treating yourself right, putting yourself together, the message to your brain is, I'm worth this time and I'm worth this treatment. But if you don't do that, then your brain is like, oh, I must not be worth anything, right? So I think that goes such a long way just in terms of how we think about self-care. Like that is an aspect of self-care too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So I want to ask something. So like, what could be the best way to provide reassurance as a partner of someone who has attachment issues, like, you know, disorganized attachment or even like avoidant attachment and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I think if somebody has an insecure attachment, one thing to know is that you can't fix them unless they want to do the work themselves, right? You can be a supportive partner, but it's really up to them to also do that work, right? So you shouldn't feel like you have to rescue them or to solve that problem, but you can, of course, reassure them when they're feeling insecure. And I think that you can validate them by saying, hey, you know what, like, my feelings for you are the same. They're the same as they were yesterday. They're going to be the same tomorrow. But I also think that we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of over-validating them, because that actually makes them overly dependent on your opinions, right? So it's kind of like, I care about you, I'm validating you, but if you're asking me how I feel about you every hour, every second, every day, at the end of the day, I can't keep providing that for you because my feelings are basically what they are, you know? And so I think that it's also about setting boundaries about what you're willing to do in a relationship. And especially for someone who has anxious attachment as the partner, it can be very exhausting because they're constantly asking you for validation. If you have a avoidantly attached partner, they may try to be basically trying to get more and more distant from you when you're trying to have a connection. And so at some point, it's like, hey, you know, I'm here. I want to have real connection with you. But if that's not where you are, then that's okay. Like maybe this relationship isn't going to work, right? But really keeping in mind that they're kind of presenting as they are, so you have to take them as they are too.
A lot of times, I feel like when teenagers nowadays, you know, everyone wants to get in a good school. They have this type of inferiority that they, you know, they're not doing enough as other people are doing and stuff like that, or like, you know, they're not competitive enough in their class, or they think they're, you know, ignorant in a way in some things. Would you think that that would also be denoted as like, you know, self-sabotaging, or there could be a way to like, you know, with what you said, like encourage yourself?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to encourage yourself and to stay focused on your own barometer. It's so easy, though, to try to compare with everyone else.
Yeah.
Like, who got into what school? That means they're smarter than me. And it's like, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't. I know that that sounds like it's not true, but it is, because obviously the people on the other side on admissions, like, they make mistakes. You know, sometimes really great people just slip through the cracks and you don't get in, and it sucks, but like, it's not a perfect system, right? And so you do have to find some way to validate yourself even when you come through hardships like that. And also to say, you know, yeah, am I a little jealous that this other person got into this school or got a better grade than me or got onto this team and I really wanted it? Of course, and you should acknowledge that, right? Because it's ridiculous as a human to say, I'm never jealous or I'm not envious. It's like, of course, that feeling is there, but it's about kind of stepping back and saying, but now that I've acknowledged it, like, what is something that I can do to affirm myself and to make myself feel better, right? And it's not really about ultimately what everybody else wants and thinks of you.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you, could you share some of practical exercise that from your book that our listeners can apply to their daily life?
Yeah, definitely. Well, one of the things that I think is the most helpful is having a good morning routine. And that's a really great time where you can integrate self-care and self-development practices. And I know that that can be sometimes hard. You're like, oh, I just want to sleep in. But the good thing is morning routines can be like 15 minutes. Like it doesn't have to be this huge, long thing. But I always think that it's helpful for it to have a couple of different components. So the first one is something that's reflective and inspirational. So that could be something where you read a quote or two that's really inspiring, read a passage out of a book that you feel like puts you in a good mood. That would be the first exercise. So that can take just a few minutes, right? And then I always think that it's helpful to have a gratitude exercise also built into your morning routine. So my favorite thing is the 3 things exercise, which basically you just wake up and you name or you write in your journal 3 things you're grateful for that day. And some days it's going to be really awesome, amazing things. Other days you're like, this is kind of a crappy day, but I can still think of 3 things, even if they're smaller ones. So just make sure that you're always acknowledging that. And then I think that the third thing, which is super helpful, is just really becoming present in some way. And so, you know, that whole idea of mindfulness, it's so hard to practice, especially when you're busy, but that's why I really like doing mindfulness that I call practical mindfulness, which means you're already tethering it to another activity you always do, right? So like if you're gonna make yourself breakfast every morning, then just make that activity mindful. Like don't do it with distractions, texting at the same time, calling somebody, you know, just focus on that task. And so tethering it to something that you already do every morning, but just reminding yourself, I'm gonna be mindful during this activity. So even a shower can be mindful, right? Because oftentimes I feel like we're in the shower, we're like thinking about stuff, making to-do lists, like just even focusing on just like, hey, like I'm just gonna enjoy the shower, like go through all of the different motions without thinking about something else at the same time.
Going back to attachment, so like, do you believe that social media, like as us teenagers, you know, we use Instagram, Snapchat, stuff like that, you know, can impact our attachment styles with our primary caregivers today, or our relationships?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that we can become attached to our social media for validation. You know, that's instead of looking for to ourselves or to healthy relationships to validate us. And so social media, I don't think is the enemy necessarily. Obviously, you know, most of us, if not all of us, are using it, but it's about consuming it in a healthy way. So if you find that you're going to social media to escape a problem a lot of the time, or you're going to social media to feel better about yourself, especially when you're stressed, and you're just overly relying on it to do some kind of coping, that's when you have to look at your practices and say, okay, maybe I need to find some other ways to cope instead of always just like flip open my social media whenever I have an uncomfortable emotion.
Well, it could be some type of like social etiquette or like technique you could use to like, you know, practice that.
Well, I think that whenever possible, it's always good to have an interaction in real life, right? So obviously that's not always practical, but even instead of texting somebody on social media, like just pick up the phone and call them and have like a 2-minute conversation. That is such a basic thing, but it makes such a big difference. I also think that when you're engaging on social media, the biggest downfalls is when you're just passively scrolling because your mind is just registering all these things and all these people whose lives seem better than yours. Of course, it's just their highlight reel, but still you're just like processing it and you're thinking that this is just, you know, my life is never gonna look like that, and you get more and more down on yourself. The way that is helpful to combat that is actually to more meaningfully engage. So like stop on the photo, like actually comment, like do something that actually makes you actively engage with the platform rather than just passively scrolling. That will also really help with that consumption.
Definitely. And I really like what you said about having those social interactions in real life, because I think with social media, it's really easy to misinterpret text and stuff. And especially someone that has that type of attachment style where they are like highly dependent on the other person, it's easy to be like, oh my gosh, they didn't text me back. They didn't heart my message.
Right.
What does this mean? So I really like what you said about that.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it's very true. I think that we all overinterpret, and then you're just like stressed out, like, oh my gosh, like it's been an hour and they still haven't liked it. Or like this person liked it, but this other person didn't. They didn't like it.
And what advice will you give to someone who wants to start prioritizing themselves?
Yeah, so self-care is definitely necessary at all ages. I think that sometimes we think, oh, we don't deserve it, or that's like when I've finally finished something and I'm happy with myself and I'm going to do it. But actually, self-care is just necessary because you can't really do all the things, be as healthy as possible, have great relationships if you don't start with taking care of yourself. And so I would say that self-care is something that you can do every single day, and it's really just about being intentional about it, like knowing and recognizing when an activity is a self-care activity. So of course, all of us would be like, okay, great. I want to look forward to like that next vacation or that next big gift I'm buying for myself. But that's not possible every day. And yet you can still do something small every day. So there's 6 areas of self-care. There's social self-care, emotional self-care, intellectual self-care, physical self-care, spiritual self-care, and then practical self-care. And I think with all those 6 areas, if you can just tell yourself, okay, today is my emotional self-care day. Like Monday is emotional self-care, Tuesday is practical self-care. And you're just kind of lining that up through the week. And then Sunday, you can repeat one of the areas of self-care that you think you enjoyed the most that week or that you need the most. But when we think about these 6 areas, they're not big and daunting because you're only focusing on one each day. And it can be something so simple, right? So like for social self-care, literally you can just be like, oh, I'm just going to call that person I've been wanting to call and wanting to connect with today. That could literally be that self-care activity. Or practical self-care is the things that you have to do because if they pile up, it'll actually cause stress. So interestingly, practical self-care could be laundry, you know? So like it can be so much more simple than I think people are making self-care to be.
To wrap things up, any final advice you'd like to give any of our viewers who, might identify with these type of avoidant attachment styles?
Especially with like identity or like role confusion, like because we
Yeah.
are teenagers, we are in our
Right.
prime, so
Yeah.
we're still exploring. So we just want to know a piece of advice that you could give.
Yeah, I mean, identity is, like you said, it's sort of the main thing that you guys are all dealing with as teenagers. Obviously, I was a teenager once. I remember that. It was very, very stressful and daunting. And I would just say so much of it is really anchoring yourself and your values. And so, again, at my age, when I was a teenager, I didn't even think about values because, again, it's just about goals and checking things off and, like, being the best, et cetera, right? But at the end of the day, what's going to really matter and help with your identity development and help you to feel secure is to know what your top values are and try to live by them. And so values are different from goals because they can't really be checked off. It's like principles that you think are important to you and how you want to live your life and how you want to be spoken about in the room when somebody says, oh, hey, like, what's Mia like? What's Tanya like? What's AJ like? And it's like the things that you hope people say about you when you're not there to listen. So values are things like community or adventure or a thirst for knowledge or integrity. And if you know what your top values are and you can just, you can literally Google values card sort or values list, and that's a good way to just kind of see what the common values are, and you can, from there, circle the top ones for you. Just keeping that top of mind, and whenever you have to make a hard decision or whenever going for a goal gets really tough, just reminding yourself, okay, but integrity is super important to me. So like, being that that's the case, what's one thing I can do right now to honor that value? Because I know that that's crucial to how I feel about myself. I think that you're going to feel much more secure about these difficult times of your life where you're just trying to figure out who you are and what you want to do and how you want to spend your life.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
Judy
you.
Ho, for coming to our podcast. It really means a lot. Our goal is to, as us teenagers, is to help other teenagers who are in our community in Napa, American Canyon, all over the world, really, to just ensure that, we all went through the experiences ourselves, and it's okay to, it's okay to be yourself. It's okay to, make mistakes. It's okay to, just be yourself in a way and not be, judged and, not have that mental set of like, everything is bad and everything can be done. So
Yeah. It's been great to be here. Thank you guys so much for all your thoughtful questions. And yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's like you are who matters, and your own opinion matters. And so don't overly depend on anyone else to tell you, what you should be doing and how you should feel about yourself. Because at the end of the day, you're the one looking at yourself in the mirror, and you should like that version of you.